we've been putting people in a box for too long, and we've only been speaking to one particular group of people and how they do things. And it's time to speak to everybody. It's time to at least open ourselves up to the different types of possibilities and different perspectives there are.
You're listening to With Etiquette, a conversational podcast focusing on practical change within the wedding and creative communities. I'm your host, Serena J., a visual creator with over a decade of experience in the wedding industry. Through this podcast, we'll be discussing ethical business practices, positive mental health, and the overall goal to make our industry a welcoming and inclusive one for all. I invite you to join along. This is the very first episode on the podcast, and I'm so excited. Jess McSweeney is someone I have had the absolute pleasure of knowing for about 7 or 8 years now. She is someone I have shared many honest and authentic conversations with throughout my time in the wedding industry. In this episode, we chat about a variety of topics, mainly surrounding language inclusivity within the wedding industry, but we also talk a little bit about growth and how it's okay to make mistakes. There are segments that I think are so important to digest if this is a topic you are unfamiliar with. Jess actually wrote a separate article, which you can check out on etiquetteforcreatives.com, that really talks about the steps that can be taken to make your language more inclusive to potential couples approaching you about your artistry and services. So with all of that to say, welcome to the podcast, Jess. I would love for you to share, in your own words, a little bit about you.
Well, hello. My name is Jess McSweeney. I am a calligrapher, a writer. I feel like I wear a lot of hats now, so it's hard to kind of give my elevator pitch, but I mainly work in paper goods, invitations, calligraphy, all of that good stuff. And then in this wild year of pandemic times, I've also taken up creative copywriting for small businesses. So I feel like I get to work with a lot of different people in the wedding industry and other creative people, and it's a lot of fun.
I actually remember when we first met. I think it was 2012 or 2013. You were working for an event planning firm at that time.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get into the industry in the first place?
I had no idea what I wanted to do. That helps to start there. To start with, basically having no sense of anything about what you want to do with your life, so you'll do anything. I was in college, and someone in my sorority was friends with Katie Clark, who is the owner of Lemon and Lime Event Design here in Baltimore. And she kind of casually mentioned that they were starting an event planning company. And I was like, I like planning sorority events. Maybe I should do that. So I reached out to them for an internship. I think they were like, why is this random person we don't know reaching out? But they were super nice about it and let me actually be their intern during the summer of 2012. And from there, I just had a lot of fun doing it. They ended up offering me a job when I graduated. So I moved down to Baltimore and just started doing sort of like anything they would let me do for events. When you're a small business, small team, you end up wearing a lot of hats. So I was doing like marketing stuff and design stuff and working events. At the same time, to be able to pay my bills, I also got a job working for a bridal salon and at a J. Crew. So it was sort of a great chance to meet a lot of different people. And working at the bridal salon was probably the biggest contributor to me figuring out what I wanted to do, because Mia, the owner at Garnish Boutique where I worked, really became like a business mentor to me, and getting to see her run a small business was incredibly informative and amazing. And she was just a wonderful person to be, a young 22-year-old learning how things work with. And from there, I started kind of playing around with lettering for fun, just as a side thing, and quickly realized it was something that there weren't really a lot of professionals doing it in the Baltimore area anyway. This was probably like 2014 at this point. And yeah, I ended up getting a few jobs through the bridal salon because I was doing her dress tags. And people saw them and were like, oh, would you do my envelope? So I ended up doing that, and kind of things just grew pretty organically from there. I decided to start my company in early 2015 and got into invitations from there. It's all very like snowbally, like one thing happens and then the next thing happens. So I never really had like a solid plan. It all sort of ended up happening that way. And early on, I thought like maybe I'll be a DJ, maybe I'll be a makeup artist. And I laugh at that now because my musical taste is questionable and my makeup skills are also questionable. So it's been definitely a fun ride. And I will say the Baltimore wedding community specifically is very just nice and small, and I think people are all very, like, friendly and welcoming, so it's been a great journey getting from that place to here.
I really love how you called that a journey. And my personal experience, it's a similar thing. So for me, I started with photography back in 2009 full time. And nowadays I work almost exclusively doing cinematography with Josh, who is my partner. I would consider this an evolution in some ways, especially when it comes to the creative journey and endeavors. We're all human. We all grow into the world every passing day. And for you, it was a self discovery through several paths. You mentioned that you worked with Mia over at Garnish Boutique in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm sure you had the opportunity to see a variety of people come into the boutique looking for dresses or looking for attire. I remember talking with you about inclusivity when it comes to clients. So, brides and brides, or someone looking to find the perfect attire who was previously married. This must have given you a lot of perspective when it came to the clients and the couples being in the wedding industry.
Yeah, I think the thing that when I was younger, I probably didn't realize is that people who are coming in not in the traditional, I guess, like heteronormative wedding or first marriage or, kind of fit that young bridal standard. I mean, really, the experience they want is not that different. I think in terms of like the service you give them, if it's different at all. In my mind, I thought like, oh, like, do you have to make more accommodations for somebody or act differently or be different. And in reality, people just want to have the same wonderful experience that you're giving to everyone. And if you are giving that to everyone, it's more about adjusting kind of what you're doing to show people that they're welcome there and then giving them the same experience that you would give absolutely anyone. And I think that was sort of an intimidating thing, thinking you were going to have to change what you were doing to serve a different group of people. But that's not really necessary in the end. And we had the best times with different clients who were coming in who didn't kind of fit that traditional mold or were just in a different situation. And honestly, it's really about just being yourself and giving the best experience you can. And you are going to have a great time with people from different backgrounds and, having a wedding that doesn't necessarily fit what we're all told weddings are.
I think what we're all told weddings are aren't necessarily what weddings actually are, because in the wedding community for so many years, both industry professionals and publications have used the terms bride and groom fairly regularly. I know you and I, off the record, we've talked a lot about changing that narrative in general because they aren't just brides, they aren't just grooms. There are brides and grooms, along with those who are non binary and don't specifically identify as either. I mean, truthfully, our industry is the forefront to weddings. So, for our couples that we are working alongside, we are the first people to use the language they see on our websites and on our social media accounts. And because of that, it's super essential for us to remind ourselves how important it is to be accountable and to collectively work towards welcoming every type of human into this experience. Because each and every one of us as professionals, it's a part of a process to create this beautiful and hopefully lasting memory for the couples who inquire and the couples we ultimately end up working with.
I think you're right about sort of the industry needing to lead on being more inclusive in terms of the way we're talking about things. Most people who are having a wedding have never navigated planning before. I think that's why they hire professionals for the most part. We hear that all the time. And really, when it comes to language inclusivity, it's I think when people use bride and groom or just, talk about brides being the decision makers, it's coming from like a default that's been the case, I think, of how people view how weddings are planned and also how they view just like the standard relationship. I mean, even a lot of magazines in our local area used to be called X City Bride and Groom and have recently changed over to weddings or have otherwise changed their title to reflect the fact that not all couples are brides and grooms. But when it comes to changing that language and trying to be more mindful about it, I think it's really about saying, "Hey, like, I understand as a professional that there are different types of couples and there are different types of people, and all of them fall in love and all of them want to get married if they're at, the point where they're looking at your website, and they deserve to feel seen and heard." So, what could be something as small as changing your names on your contact form, for instance, from changing like bride's name, groom's name to your name, partner's name, or names of the couple? That's such a small thing that if you are, a same sex couple or you are somebody who is non binary, who is in a relationship and does not identify as she or him or bride or groom in this case, it's just signaling this very subtle thing that's to say, I am not trying to put you in a box in terms of the kind of relationship I think you have to work with me. And I'm also telling you right out the gate, I'm trying to remove the barriers that say, I'm going to make this difficult for you, or I am not going to understand you, or I am maybe somebody who's not willing to work with someone like you. I think there are a lot of ways to be very overt about saying that you do welcome people with statements on your website, but there are also very subtle things, and if that's something you really believe, that you are open to taking on different types of couples and really seeing the different diverse love stories that we have in our world, there are ways to kind of sabotage that if you're using language that's limiting or that tries to put people in the very small boxes we have for what kind of was the acceptable love for a long time or the acceptable way to identify. So it's changing language for me is exciting, especially as a writer, just because it is a way to communicate things not only in directly what you're saying, but also in what the way you're saying it and how that can communicate something as big as like acceptance and celebration. And if you're a wedding vendor, I mean, that's you want to tell your clients that you're going to make their life easier. You are going to, celebrate them and be about their relationship. That is what we were all coming together to celebrate with this big event. So, using language to put out a hand to these people and give them a warm hug is awesome. And it's such an incredible power that you can have with just this very small piece of like your website or your communications. And I know, I find that very exciting, and I think it's amazing that our industry in general is starting to move more towards awareness about signaling support for same-sex couples or signaling support for people who have different pronouns than you might immediately assume from seeing their name or what they look like, and it's exciting to me. I feel like we're in, like, a really big time for our industry and in the world, and if you want to be a progressive business who is really making people feel welcome and warm to be there, it's something to really pay attention to and be excited about too.
I agree. We are in a time where change is happening, and it's so important to recognize this change and move forward with this change because, this is the future of equality and representation. I know we've talked about some of the things you've noticed over time, especially as a wedding stationer and calligrapher. I understand that you have participated in a lot of collaborations and created work for many projects. You've created some mock up invitations as well. You mentioned before just some of your thoughts when it comes to the names, even on the stationery work and the paper goods. So, in your opinion, how can we move forward in a way where we can be more inclusive with language, even on stationery as well as our websites, and just the work that we're trying to put out there for others?
Yeah, editorial work is so interesting. For a lot of us, it's a creative expression, which is super exciting. And it's kind of like a chance to get out your creative dreams and hopefully appeal to that client that maybe is inspired by what you're doing, or just as an artist to challenge yourself in some way. Sometimes I know for stationers, and I'll speak for a lot of us, it can also be exhausting to be asked to be a part of like a million different editorials. So, and for any vendor, it can be expensive, it can be a lot. And I think there's a whole conversation that we really need to be having as an industry around editorial work in terms of not just sexual orientation and gender identity inclusivity, but every other person we are not representing in shoots, specifically people who are not, a very thin body type, people with disabilities, different races and religions and ethnic backgrounds, and just anything you can be different from kind of the norm that's being portrayed now, which tends to be, straight, white, thin people who are able bodied. There's a lot of work to do there. And I think, especially when you think about the fact that this is supposed to be like our biggest creative expression, I want our creative expression to be bigger than just this very small lens of the world. Look at all the different types of people there are in the world. We should be celebrating that in our creative endeavors as well. And that really honestly gives even more opportunity to be creative and to just expand the lens of what we see. So, all of that to say that when it comes to my particular line of work with stationery, this is something I think about a lot. When you're kind of like a sub vendor, I guess, who's not the one that's creative directing the shoot, there are a lot of opportunities to kind of sneak in some different gender identity or sexual orientation inclusivity, even if the models are an opposite sex couple. When you're making something up completely, there's nothing to say that the parents of the couple are not queer. So, something I've started doing is maybe imagining the couple having, like, let's say there, I have one project I'm working on right now that's editorial, that the groom has two dads. So, kind of in my mind, anyway, the story I've built around it as the paper, I've written up this groom and then like son of two men's names. I think when it comes to larger conversations where you can more influence the creative direction, and you can do that as a vendor who is not necessarily in the position of planner or photographer, who I think are the ones who are usually planning these shoots on the bigger scales. I think it's important that if these things are important to you, to say basically, I won't participate in projects that are not trying to have more diversity, both in the content of the shoot and also in the vendor team. This was actually something I had a conversation with a friend about recently, who was saying that kind of in the wake of everything this summer with Black Lives Matter and people kind of becoming more aware of the fact that our shoots are not diverse enough in many ways, there were a lot of projects she was seeing that would have, Black models or otherwise be bringing in more racial diversity, but then the entire vendor team would be white. And she's like, that's not really good enough or doing what this is supposed to be doing. So I think something that I know a lot of people have talked about, and it's sort of like a Hollywood thing that came after some of the Me Too movement stuff and various things around the Oscars, I remember, is inclusion riders. So basically saying, I will not participate in this project unless both the shoot content and the vendor team behind it are going to be X percent or have X number of people who are not straight white people basically working it. So, but to kind of get back to your question about, names specifically on stationery, it's really awesome then if you have a shoot that's going to have maybe a couple who is not an opposite sex couple or cisgender couple, to be able to have names that are not a man and a woman in the traditional sense. And also, if you are creating work that is just for you, that is maybe just like a sample you're going to give to other people, and there is not a larger shoot component to it, you can pick whatever names you want. So I think being more mindful of gender neutral names or just having fun with it and maybe having a couple that's two women or two men or just mixing it up a little bit. I think the heteronormative stuff is kind of the default, and we can change that if we think about it a little bit more and make a mindful effort to do that differently.
You're right. Over the years, it has been in general, the default, especially when you look at features and publications and everything that is being shown to couples, real couples who are out there looking for inspiration. You see a lot of the same thing. And you made so many great points there. The fact is, we are an industry where we are telling stories of our clients who are actual couples, not models, hired to execute a pre planned vision. Unfortunately, so many collaborations and editorial projects out there are executed to create this stereotypical relationship story as, in quote, portfolio content. And sure, I love fashion and design and beautiful dresses, but that's just not the reality for everyone. And not everyone wears dresses. And there are so many people out there who, even if they do identify as a woman, do not lean towards styles with a flair of femininity. I mean, for generations, society as a whole has pushed a general narrative. Our industry is supposed to be one of love, one of acceptance. So we need to be collectively thinking in this way. And we need to be considering the many walks of life that exist in this world, which honestly brings me back to that aspect of storytelling again. Storytelling is such an important element in what we do, whether you're a photographer or cinematographer, capturing the mood, vibe, relationship story, a planner who is providing a memorable celebration for all of the people coming together, or a stationer who is creating, honestly, one of the first guest experience elements to an event. We are all collectively part of this, and it's so important to remember the story as a whole. For instance, I love how you mentioned considering the parents of someone getting married, because that is its own story in itself. Making sure that it's not just always an, in quote, mom and a dad, because that's not the truth for everyone. There are married parents who identify as two moms or two dads, single parents, divorced parents. Mom and dad is simply not the truth for everyone.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm working on a new business I'll be launching, and I've been getting to do a lot of creative work because of it, in terms of stationery design that is kind of reigniting my fire of loving that piece of creative. And it's so much fun when you get to start from nothing and get to really build a backstory. Like, I feel like I've gotten to a point where now I can't design without having a backstory for that couple, at least in my own mind. Like, thinking about what their favorite songs are, or thinking about how they met. And I mean, I think any of us, for any wedding we've been to that's, a personal wedding or a client wedding, but I think a lot of, like, my cousin's wedding, for instance, you see how much that means to their parents. You see how much that means to all the people who are a part of their lives and love them. And to create something that's really them, whether that be stationery or their vision for their florals, or, how you capture their images, I think it's like you almost need to know that. And I think in creative work, when you're getting to kind of make it up from scratch, it's just so much more meaningful to me when I get to be like, this is how the groom's dads feel about the rehearsal dinner they're going to be hosting, or this is how this couple met at a trivia bar. These are actual examples from the work I've been doing lately, so it's been really fun. And getting to bring those elements into their wording or their design elements. And there are so many opportunities when you're doing creative work just for you to really have fun and make these real people and make them, fully three-dimensional. And with that comes understanding that people don't fit into just opposite sex, cisgender. I mean, even we see it all the time with, like, divorce, for instance. Like, a lot of parents are divorced, but so often I think in creative work, it's always like, if you're going to put family names, it's like married parents, and that's just not everyone's experience. And it's so much richer and more true to life, I think, when you get to play around with illustrating the different ways that people exist on this planet.
You're absolutely right. And I think in general, you look back over the years and people kind of have this idea of what a, in quote, perfect family should be, but that's not the actual reality. And there are so many different ways that people exist on this planet. I think it's such an important reminder and it's such an important consideration to take in as you're going through life day to day, Just because I have one experience as a human living in this world doesn't mean that there isn't someone else experiencing the world in an entirely different way. I think that's what makes humanity beautiful. We aren't all the same. We all have a unique perspective that has grown from how we experience the world. If you have family, how you were raised may have had a lot to do with how you process the world around you. The various jobs we hold, the people we're introduced to throughout our lives. I mean, all of these factors play a part in how we as individuals are navigating the world to this day. So, one thing I wanted to go back to was we had that conversation about how things went down over the summer and how people were in such a rush to create content that was, in quote, more diverse for their portfolios. As someone who does not identify as white, it's really been a struggle to see the lack of representation from day to day. I mean, I remember going through grade school and there was just this constant lack of perspective. Nearly every one of my white friends' favorite movies growing up star people who look nothing like myself, or if they did look like myself, they had an accent or a certain look to them. So when you grow up in the US as a non white person, you understand these things. There have been biases. This country was founded and structured in a way to favor certain groups of people. And ever since, the minorities in this country have been fighting for fairness, for equality, for representation. And, it's taken a lot of work and generations of work really to get to where we are now. And there's still, to this day, a lot of work to be done. Honestly, though, that was a huge reason for starting this project, for starting Etiquette. I know I'm not the most seasoned person existing in this industry by any means, but I've been full time working professionally since 2009. From that point until now, I've witnessed a general lack of representation in vendor roles, in terms of couples being featured. And, there are professionals who have been in this industry for longer than I have who I'm sure feel the same way. So it kind of comes back to this: representation matters, not just in the content that is being created, not just with the couples who are being published. It's also very important to take a look at the vendor team behind everything. So frequently, creatives get together to create this portfolio content or this submission content with their friends. Now, let me preface this with saying that there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with getting together and working alongside your friend group. When you're in a friend group, you're comfortable most of the time. People enjoy being comfortable. People enjoy not being judged too, especially when it comes to the artistic process, when it comes to experimenting with new things. Sometimes when you're with friends, it's easier to let go and to do that. But, a lot of collaborations are also concept or style collaborations. So, for example, we've all seen Pantone Color of the Year collaborations. There's nothing wrong with being inspired by a color. I think it's great. But maybe take a moment to think about how you can broaden your network when you're approaching concepts like that and wanting to execute concepts like that. Sure, we're all creatives, but we're also businesses. Take this opportunity to reach out to creatives who you want to build a relationship with. Get to know them as humans. That's how friendships are formed anyway, right?
I think, and I say this as somebody who has made a lot of mistakes in the past and who continues to make mistakes all the time. It's kind of like my bread and butter. I think that when it comes to, especially everything that I think we saw unfolding this summer in our industry specifically, besides the entire world at large, I think people have good intentions a lot of the time. And the big thing I've learned through kind of following different anti racist people and people in different marginalized communities who have been talking about their experiences with oppression is that intentions and impact are different things. And you can have all the best intentions in the world and make a really negative impact at the same time. And it doesn't negate the impact you made just because your intentions were good. It doesn't make you a bad person or anything. It's just that the impact you make has to matter too. Honestly, it has to matter more because, I think the analogy I've seen is that, like, if you hit somebody with your car, even if you didn't mean to, you still hit them with your car. There was still damage done. So when it comes to things in the wedding industry, I think when people are trying to diversify their portfolios or make it, at least on the surface level, seem like they're more inclusive or more welcoming, because they really genuinely feel that way. I don't think people are doing that just for the sake of looking good to people. I think a lot of times people, they really do want to do better and they feel bad that they have not done better up to this point. The thing with tokenizing, which is, that idea we're talking about where you're kind of plucking one piece of diversity and putting it at the center, like say having models of different races or having a queer couple at the forefront, is that if nothing else about your perspective, specifically your team or other elements of how you've put this project together, usually I think we're talking about shoots just to start, but when you don't have those other elements that kind of actually inform that perspective, you can still cause harm because you're making yourself and your team look inclusive. But are you actually doing anything to elevate queer vendors or vendors of color or just people with different perspectives than you to, I guess, give them both a leg up in the industry that maybe they've been denied up until that point, but also to tell their own stories? I think that's really a big part of it. Like I'm a queer woman and I think about I have a ton of privilege being both white, cisgender, and bisexual, which means that I often get to pass as straight if I'm in a relationship with a man. And with that, though, I think there are experiences being bisexual where we get erased a lot from conversations around marriage specifically, because if you're marrying a man, it's, just treated like a straight relationship. And if you are marrying a woman, in my case, it would be seen as a gay or same sex wedding, whereas it kind of erases your bisexuality from that conversation. So I think how this relates back to creative work is that if you want to tell a queer story, and maybe I saw an instance of this actually where a couple was two bisexual women who were getting married and they kept being described everywhere their wedding was published as a gay couple. And they came out and said, "We're not a gay couple. We are two bisexual women." And that erasure, I think, doesn't happen as much when you actually have people from that community who are involved in the project, who are on your editorial team, who, in the case of the blogs, if they're on your writing staff, like people catch these things when you have different perspectives in the room. So when you're planning a shoot, if you are trying to actually make a good impact for, let's say Black vendors or queer vendors in the industry, have them on your team, have them informing the creative process, have them giving their perspectives. And I think specifically with weddings, I mean, so much of editorial work beyond creative expression is about building relationships that then will turn into actual weddings or actual money for your business. So when you work with a team and a couple really loves your work and they see that team around you, I've heard this time and again, like people want to hire that whole team sometimes. Like I know I've talked to a couple DC vendors where this is the case, where they work together a lot and people are like, "Oh, if I get this vendor, I have to get this vendor too." And when you diversify the offerings you have, like if you're bringing in people who maybe wouldn't have ever seen this amazing Black photographer or this amazing queer planner or queer florist or whatever that background may be, it gives an opportunity to kind of help elevate and diversify our business and have a positive impact in our industry and beyond just making your own portfolio look more diverse. And beyond that, I mean, there are just amazingly talented people in this whole industry. And I don't think there's anything wrong with having a trusted team of people. I think it's a lot of work a lot of the time to kind of diversify your people that are on your recommended list, especially when you want like a very trusted, specific thing for your clients or your editorial shoot. And you don't want to kind of have the stress of, I guess, branching out from people you haven't worked with before. I think that almost does a disservice to your own work and your own things you have going on, but also the industry as a whole, to not be like, hey, like, how can I do this thing where my impact will also make our industry kind of highlight these people who maybe would not have been highlighted before, or I don't know, just give chance for new voices to come into the industry and make it even better. So yeah, that's my long rant about that. But I think it's really important that, yeah, the work and the intentions you go into in making that work also have a positive impact on the people you're trying to highlight and the industry as a whole.
I agree with you. A lot of people within our industry really do have good intentions. I realized this after having so many conversations with professionals in regards to this project, with etiquette, even. So, before this podcast that we were recording, I spoke with many people from all walks of life and with many different perspectives for years. And it was just so interesting to listen to all of the stories that were shared and complications they've come across over the time that they've been in the industry. Overall, it seems as if people want to do the right thing, but they don't know how to approach the situation that they're dealt. So it's really important for people to hear this because they just might not know it, or they might just not be thinking about it because they haven't crossed paths with the information within their circle of professionals. Because we all know that this industry consists of, groupings of people who worked together from the beginning and got to know each other through different networks or through different shoots or different vendors or events. So there are circles. And, as much as we don't like to admit that, it is the case. And it's kind of like that just throughout the world and through society. And I think what's just important is to put this information out there and have a discussion like this publicly. We all have something to learn. We all have a career path to grow into. We can all do better, each and every single one of us, even if you consider yourself fairly diverse in terms of your portfolio and your network. There's still more people out there, new people, people you just haven't worked with, different styles. There's a lot in terms of diversity in general. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that. Everyone is in a different place as a human in their business, in this industry. And, the only way forward is to understand that there's growth.
I really think that the fear of making a mistake holds us all back in so many ways. Like that fear of doing something wrong and being shamed for it in some way. I'm not really someone controversial who believes that cancel culture exists. I don't think that cancel culture is something that actually ends up being the case for most people. I think that there are consequences when people make mistakes, but that most of the time, when people come with an endeavor to make things right and to do things in the spirit of learning and doing better, that most people will welcome them with open arms, especially if they apologize adequately for what they've done and make genuine amends. So, we all make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time when it comes to various inclusivity things, especially for circles that I am not personally a part of, groups that I am not a member of. And I think that fear can't hold you back from trying to do better. And it really is always, I think, the Maya Angelou quote of when you know better, you do better is really true. And I think I might mention this in the article that I wrote for Etiquette, but I have a family member who is trans, and we wrote her coming out letter to our family together. And she specifically wanted to note that there are going to be people who, mess up her pronouns, for instance, and use her dead name or use her pronouns with the gender she was born with, or the sex she was born with, rather. See, just there, that was a little mistake. She said she cared a lot more about people trying and not making a huge deal when they make a mistake, but just correcting themselves and trying to do better next time. And I think that really goes true for a lot of things. Try and spend as much time as you can learning yourself and not putting that burden on people in oppressed groups to educate you. Google is free is always the thing I see, but know that if you do make a mistake, not getting defensive immediately and actually trying to determine, where did I go wrong here and what can I learn from this and how can I make a genuine apology to really show that wasn't the impact I meant to make, and to apologize for making that harm. I think we all, in all ways, not just in matters of inclusivity, need to be better at that, at owning our stuff and trying to just be the best we can to people. And I do think most people's intentions are that. It's just, yeah, that fear of making the mistake, I think, is what holds most people back. And I get it. It's scary, but you can always do better. We always all can. So I think it's worth trying.
The reality is, we are all human. We all make mistakes. We're all learning. The purpose of this project, even, and of these discussions, it's to help others understand that it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to not know everything. What can be so challenging within our industry is remembering even the creative professionals that exist and run their businesses, they all come from various walks of life. Business owners and creatives hold different values and contrasting beliefs. These beliefs and behaviors are frequently a result of how a particular individual is brought up. And as we all know, we aren't born knowing everything. Our individual experiences in life shape how we are to this day, and that unfortunately includes many biases and identifiers. So, if you grew up in an environment where you were limited to interactions with communities of different races, cultures, shapes, religions, etc., you likely didn't have conversations relating to these topics. But what's important is acknowledging change and understanding that these communities do exist. These communities are important and they want to be treated equally. Change isn't something that occurs overnight. So it's essential to take the necessary steps to accept others the way that you would want to be accepted. And our wedding industry is a community of businesses built around acceptance, built around love. So these values are incredibly important to remember as creatives who are at the forefront of the marriage experience. So we're business owners and entrepreneurs. And for a lot of us too, it's about being an artist. And artists can be very sensitive. Artists many times depend on a level of validation when it comes to visual work. For us, offering a creative service to others, a client taking that step to hire you, that's the validation. That's showing you as an artist that you have value to another person and that you're worth being compensated, that you're worth being paid for creating the work or providing the services you offer. Because of this, it's so easy to get caught up or emotional. It's also difficult to admit failure or lack of knowledge, but that's a part of being human. And we're all in this industry of working with other humans who are coming together to celebrate a personal commitment in their lives. They're hiring a team of creative vendors to execute a vision that they hope will become one of the happiest memories in their lives. And, that's a lot of pressure. So, if we want to be inclusive vendors, we need to take the steps to research and learn. We've all been there. We all remember what it was like to first start our businesses. Many times, as a new business owner, you're fumbling around, you're basing things off of what you know or what you think you know as an individual. Ultimately, when couples come to our websites, to our social media accounts, to spaces where we have a platform or a presence, their feelings matter. It's a general fear for a lot of people who do not identify as a bride and a groom to be rejected. Unfortunately, there have been fairly recent instances within our industry of couples being turned away because of their identifiers. And I'm not talking about just being turned away because they aren't the right fit. There is a distinct difference between not being the right fit because of your style of artistry not lining up with what they're looking for, and turning away someone because you discriminate against their relationship. Discrimination should never be an option to choose. It's absolutely no different to me from when it became legal to marry and live together with someone of a different race. There was a time when that wasn't considered acceptable either, due to how people interpreted their religious texts or because they chose to discriminate. So, with all of that to say, we need to change the way we use our words and how we speak to people, because making those changes is important in eliminating that fear and that rejection. Changing our language and the way that we approach people is a small step in welcoming all couples.
You kind of just reminded me of something too in terms of like something that I think is also a really important thing if you do care about couples from more marginalized groups, whether that be queer couples or couples from different religions or racial backgrounds. I do think it's important to also be aware of kind of what oppression they're facing in the world. I think most people who do care about the news or just are trying to become more aware as they learn more things. I know we all have a lot going on, but it's really important to me, I will say, as a queer woman, that people that I work with are speaking out about these issues too. I think that can be very scary for people to use their platform in the way that might alienate other people in some way. There's that fear of, like, you want to appeal to everyone. It's just really important to me and means a lot to me when I have vendor friends who, and I'm not just saying on, like, Instagram or on social media. I think not everyone operates their platform where that's where they make the most impact, but I think in private conversations you're having with people in your life, or just physically showing up to protest various things, I do think it's important to be aware. For instance, right now, as we're recording, there is a lot of talk about whether or not the Supreme Court in this session wants to overturn Obergefell, which I can never pronounce right, v. Hodges, which was the case that made same sex marriage legal throughout the country. There's talk about that being on the table again, or a signaling that that might be on the table in the coming years to be overturned. And that's a constant fear that couples, I'll say in this case, queer couples are thinking about. You may have a client who's a trans person who is constantly thinking about access to things like healthcare or their right to exist without violence. And I think that is the same for people from BIPOC communities, BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color. They're facing violence and oppression at the same time as well. And to me, it's really important, if you really want to show up for people from different backgrounds, to also be actively fighting for their rights and actively trying to shed light on that, and not just kind of trying to work with them in a way that benefits you financially, but also showing up when they are worried about their rights and there are other bigger things going on in the world beyond their wedding. So that's just something I think this summer has illustrated for a lot of people, that showing up in that way matters too. However, you want to show up, whether that is voting, protesting, posting on social media, having conversations with loved ones, trying to educate yourself more. There's so many different ways to show up like that, but that's something that I just wanted to know is really important too.
It is important to show up. Equal representation is so important. Combating discrimination is so important, especially in an industry like ours, which is the wedding industry, where, like I said several times already, is supposed to be based on love and acceptance. So it's embracing the differences or similarities between cultures or religions or races. And love is something that doesn't discriminate. Love is something that is accepting. Us being here for our couples or potential couples or for our vendors, it's really showing that you're on the side of inclusivity and equal representation for all, for acceptance for all. Everyone is different in how they process and approach the world around them. I mean, people all throughout our industry, we all have different personality types. Some of us are more extroverted, some of us are more introverted. We're all different people. And the important thing to remember when we're talking with potential couples, when you're part of a marginalized group, there's always this fear for acceptance. I mean, I'll be the first to admit this. Social media is a struggle. I don't think that it's absolutely essential to share everything if you're not the type of person to do so. But if you are the type of person to do so and you are very vocal about things, I think it's important to show up then. If you firmly believe that you are your brand and you want to share all of that with people who are following along, then it's important to not just post things because other people are posting. I mean, it's important to invest back in yourself. If you aren't knowledgeable on something, you need to take a moment and think about, how can I be better? How can I be more accepting? Because we all grow, we all learn every single day. And that's really what's going to be the defining factor in us growing collectively as an industry into a place that is accepting for all vendors and for all couples.
Yeah, and that's a whole other conversation too, about whether or not social media is a toxic place to be or not. But I agree, if you're someone who's using it all the time, I think it's important to make space for these conversations. But there's definitely, if you're not someone who uses it, I think you're having conversations and you have your own platform and your own life with your friend group or with your family, and there's always ways to try and talk about these things.
You're right. And I think one of the most important ways to show up for people is actually having those conversations behind closed doors. When you're outside of the realm of social media, when you're talking to another human face to face, you're forced to have a conversation that you can't immediately run away from or completely ignore. And at that point, it's non performative. You might be 100% behind the statement that you're sharing, but a person might also share a view that they don't yet fully understand or agree with, just to feel accepted amongst their peers and just to not be judged amongst their peers. Clearly, the summer of 2020 was a fantastic example of this. A lot of people were genuinely surprised that racism exists in the States, that biases exist. Every human being experiences life in a different way. For example, I am mainly of South Korean descent. I am not in control of how I look, but nor is anyone. And it's important to take the time to understand that. There's a history of violence. It's a part of history that no one really likes to think about, but the reality is wars were fought, not just here in the States, but throughout all of the continents. At the same time, it's important to recognize that we can't magically go back in time and fix problems. To truly understand where people are coming from, people need to open up and collectively work through the issues at hand. We all have learning to do. Even if you're a member of the BIPOC community, there is always something to learn. Accepting that fact is the first step to broadening anyone's perspective. So, back to showing up. It matters immensely to stand up during personal conversations. I think it could bring life changing knowledge or perspective for your family members or friends outside of your work circle. Having these conversations, they can lead to a positive impact in other ways. People who aren't just in the wedding industry, for instance, if you have friends you hold these conversations with that are in other communities, whether that be work, recreational activities, so on, they may be able to impact individuals within their own circles by sharing their views, which may have been influenced by someone as yourself. And that too is still so valuable and impactful.
Yeah, I think, we always hear that phrase, use your privilege. And if you are a vendor who is kind of like seen as a leader in the industry or has been established, if you are a vendor who is maybe a member of a group who is not experiencing oppression or who is not regularly kind of ignored in terms of their work being published or being tokenized or any of that, I think that's how you show up and use your privilege, is to show up in those conversations and to use your platform and make space. And if you are somebody who has the privilege of controlling editorial teams, or I think about planners and photographers are usually kind of at the top of the booking vendor, or venues too are sort of the first vendors that get booked. I think that's a privilege as well, and kind of using your trust that your clients place in you to recommend different types of vendors and different people who don't necessarily fit in the groups of vendors who don't really experience oppression or discrimination in terms of hiring and all of that. There's lots of opportunities to flex that privilege muscle, as they say, to make our industry better.
100% use your privilege. What you said is so important. If you are a vendor or an artist, creative in the wedding industry who is seen as a leader and has been established, and people are following you because they admire the work that you do and want to learn from you, I think it's really important to take that into consideration. I think it's completely acceptable to just state, hey, we support racial equality, same sex marriage, want to do better as a business. And we acknowledge that the industry or businesses in society as a whole haven't done enough. And we want to move forward in a way that sheds positivity and sheds light on marginalized communities. I think that in itself is a statement that says a lot. And I think it's important too to actually take that statement that you made and put that into a project. Like we said earlier, don't tokenize people for projects, but if you feel like you haven't done enough, take the time to sit down, analyze your business, analyze yourself as a creative, and say, hey, this is what I can do better. These are the baby steps I need to make to represent more people in terms of race, in terms of religion, in terms of sexual orientation. I think that especially on social media, admitting failure is so terrifying for people, or admitting, I haven't done enough is terrifying for people, but it's also so impactful, especially when you're somebody who influences others who don't have that influence. The people who are following you can say, hey, this person who I greatly respect, they said something that I really resonate with. So, kind of getting back to language, I know this is the first conversation on the podcast, and the reason is because, you can't just jump into heavy topics. I think that that can be very overwhelming for a lot of people, but I know we've had conversations about topics like pronouns and being courteous to people, never assuming how somebody identifies. I think that it's really great that there are platforms out there that have adapted and embraced pronouns and identifiers. So, with the wedding industry, I'd love to hear if you have any additional thoughts when it comes to language and what can really be done. I know you wrote the article already, but just on this podcast to really have this discussion, I think it's so important for people to hear.
Yeah, I feel like pronouns are like the easiest thing in the world to do. The first time your name is mentioned on your website or, in your social media bio or something like that, you just throw your pronouns in there. And it's such a simple, easy way to signal to people like, hey, like you are safe to share your pronouns with me. And just to normalize that, I think in the greater it's not just for your business, but just normalizing it in the greater scheme of life. What if we just made it a normal thing everywhere just to have pronouns so that when people who do not necessarily have the privilege of passing as the gender that they are, or who maybe have just a non-binary pronoun or something like that, that people wouldn't automatically assume because of the world we live in and things like that, I think we're slowly making it more normal and just commonplace to always have pronouns everywhere, and that it makes the world safer for people from different gender identities and things like that. So it's super simple, and I've been really excited to see more people doing that, and also to have people thinking about their language, being more inclusive on their site throughout all of the copy. I think we were going to talk about the fiance thing too, which was something that blew my mind as someone who's not French and does not speak French. And I've really, for the most part, only ever seen fiance or heard it spoken, and did not know that there are two different genders to the word fiance. The one where you only have one E at the end is for a male betrothed person, and the one with two E's is for a female betrothed person. And I had no idea. I thought when people added the extra E, that was just like a fancy way of spelling it. And yeah, so that's something to be mindful of in terms of gendering people in written language with fiance as well. When you just kind of write, oh, you and your fiance, technically that is gendered. So it can be better a lot of times just to say your name, your partner's name, couple's names, things like that. But that really blew my mind. I had no idea. The French and their gendered language will get you. I feel like in English we don't really deal with that and don't think about it. So very, very interesting.
When you talk about language inclusivity, it is relatively easy for people who are English speaking to make these changes, to make these alterations to their website or their language in general, to really be welcoming to people that identify differently or might not identify as a pronoun that somebody who is looking at them might assume. So, I'm not going to bash anybody who says the word fiance. That's a word that is used within the wedding community, but I think it's important if you're spelling it out on your website, that can certainly alienate people, because if you have a couple that you're working with and you know that they identify as a man and a woman, I think it's entirely fine to use those words because you know that about them. But when it comes to things like contact forms, you don't know who's on your website. it could be anybody. You don't know who's going to inquire with you. It can be anybody. So, not having those assumptions right off the bat is so important to really making the experience of hosting a celebration, of planning a celebration, to not feel like an attack for someone who is just looking to create a beautiful and memorable event for all of their loved ones. You know, when you're making that commitment in the first place to start your married life together with a person, that's a huge step. So, this whole conversation has been great. It's been about how we can really eliminate that discrimination factor that has been in our industry, sometimes unintentionally. I know a lot of vendors who will say brides when they're talking to people and, you know, having personal conversations with them. They're not anti anything. It's just that's been kind of a habitual behavior. I think it's so important for us having this conversation to remind people that, hey, we can all do better. We can all make these small changes that will eventually be a big community change. Another thing I wanted to say too is that if you have a couple who is looking at your services and they are a man and a woman, what's to say that the man isn't on your website looking at your services, looking at your artistry? Who's to say it is the bride? I feel like the industry as a whole has almost always catered towards brides a bit more than anyone. And I think that's just an important thing to really consider. There are grooms out there too who want to be involved. Personally, I really love that. I think that a wedding and planning a celebration should be a joint decision. I know that there are people out there that don't agree with that, or maybe one of them just isn't very interested in planning, and that's completely fine. But I think in general, it's important to never assume that if it is a bride and a groom, that the groom isn't looking at your services, that the groom isn't contacting, you know, maybe the groom is really interested in logistics and planning and wants to get in touch, or is an artist himself and is creative. And, you know, it's just important to take that into consideration as well when you're forming language on your website or speaking about things on social media. I think it's essential to never make an assumption.
Right? I always think about that with stationery because back when I was doing invitations full time, I had certain couples where I remember once dropping off the stationery to the groom, and he literally looked at me like, I've never seen these before. I'm like totally bewildered. He had nothing to do with the process, right? Like he totally passed that off to his future wife. And then I had another couple that I still talk to 5 years later. I love them so much. They just had a baby, and I got to do something for them for that. And in that case, the groom was like the most involved groom I have ever had. He cared about the decisions just as much. He was at all the meetings. And even just if all of my language had been geared towards just speaking to her, I feel like it would have excluded him. And that's, it's his wedding too. So I feel like it's totally true. Like he could have been the one doing the research on the stationery vendor for all I know. So just I think it's like there's some gender role stuff at play there too about who plans the wedding and who the wedding is for, and it being, the bride's day, that we can best in terms of that too. I have my hands and fists. This is a podcast, so you can't see, but I'm like punching the air, busting it. Um, in terms of like the norms of who a wedding is for and who it's planned for too, that you aid that cause in addition to being more inclusive to different types of couples. So it's true. We gotta, Operation 2021, make sure it's people know that everybody can plan the wedding.
Josh and I actually talk about this all of the time because we are both artists and we both have our own opinions on what we like visually. And they're pretty strong opinions because we're both in this field. This can't be said for everyone, but it's important to take everyone's views into consideration. For so long, there have been traditions and statements and assumptions, and within planning weddings, the assumption that a bride is always the one that is planning a wedding or is interested in planning a wedding, that assumption needs to go, because that is an assumption that is hurting potential couples out there. I think these assumptions need to be reevaluated, need to be talked about, and we just need to make a collective effort as a community to really combat what past generations have said weddings needed to be, because they aren't. And I think it's so important as vendors, as creatives, as people who are providing a service, to never make assumptions, because assumptions can alienate people. It kind of comes back to this whole conversation about inclusivity and making sure that people who are planning an event, people who are on the vendor team, all feel accepted and all feel represented, because that is what is going to make this industry and society as a whole a better one, a stronger one, a place where people don't feel like I'm not relevant enough to be shared. It's getting rid of all of those ideas that have been nurtured for so long and saying, hey, there's a more positive way and a more inclusive way to do this. Let's take those steps and move forward in this way.
Yeah. I think kind of what this whole conversation really boils down to is just that for so long, our industry and, a lot of things in life have been about one way of doing things and one perspective. And something that I think has been beautiful about the world over, at least my lifetime has been seeing how much our perspectives are kind of changing to say, hey, there's actually like a lot of ways for life to be experienced and lived. And there are a lot of ways for people to approach even the same sort of institution like marriage. And we've been putting people in a box for too long, and we've only been speaking to one particular group of people and how they do things. And it's time to speak to everybody. It's time to at least open ourselves up to the different types of possibilities and different perspectives there are, and start making how we market and talk about things within our businesses more open to those different perspectives, instead of kind of closing people off right before they even hire you or speak to you. So yeah, this kind of all comes down to just openness, and that is such a beautiful thing and such a hopeful thing. And I think that's why I hope people, if they're kind of like overwhelmed by this topic, because I've had conversations with vendors in person where it's like, oh crap, like I didn't know this, I didn't know that, like this is so much, I want to shut down. I think it's remembering that like this is a process and nobody was born knowing everything. And it's just about being open. It's about saying like, hey, I want to open my mind to the different types of experiences that exist in this world and try and make sure I'm making as many people from those different backgrounds as possible feel comfortable and feel seen and feel like their love matters and is celebrated as well. And that I also am aware of the experience they're having in the world and the struggles they have. Maybe I don't know everything about it, but I want to listen and I want to support them. And that is just, you're not always going to get it right, but it's about that openness. And I think that that's such a beautiful thing. And hopefully that's more encouraging than overwhelming. Even if it's both, I totally get that. I think it's more exciting than it is scary.
You just said it right there. It's all about openness and working towards that. A lot of this can be overwhelming, but it's so important to be open to this change and acknowledging the unintentional mistakes and just saying, hey, I want to be accepting towards the people who are coming to me because they love what services I offer or are inspired by what I do. I think openness is so important. With all of that said, Jess, I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I so appreciate you being here and willing to speak with me on this podcast. It has certainly been a journey to develop this entire project. And, it's one of those things where conversations are so important, but I never wanted it to feel forced. And I think it's been great because having these conversations with you over the years, a lot of it really led to this point now. And I think it's great to talk openly about topics that people are scared to talk about because they don't know or they're afraid to ask. The only way, really, in society to move forward is to talk about it, to work through it, to see what can be done that will lead to the world being a more positive place or a more understanding place.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I really am just so happy that if anything has come out of this year, which we all, again, I suppose someone could be listening to this in like 5 years and be like, what was, I hopefully, I don't think we'll ever forget 2020, but just to know that it seems like these conversations and awesome projects like etiquette are kind of coming out of this space we've all gained this year, if for nothing else. And it's been really wonderful. I'm really hopeful about our industry and about the world right now. I'm hopeful that things are going to be better. Thank you for creating this project too, because I think that's a huge part of it. And I'm excited for what our industry might look like in a couple years because of this kind of work. So thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast for future conversations to help educate and push our industry towards positivity. This project and podcast is currently self-funded, but for more information on how to support us, please visit etiquetteforcreatives.com.